Thanks for tuning in to Within the Frame. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Han Da-eun. This year's NATO Summit captured global attention for many reasons, one of them being the alliance's blunt warnings against Russia, North Korea, and China. It condemned the growing military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, and for the first time officially criticized China's alleged support for Russia in the Ukraine war. The Western alliance also expanded its partnerships with Indo-Pacific nations, including South Korea, as it looks to counter China's perceived threat in the region. How will the summit results impact the already vivid divide between nations that share democratic values and those that don't? What impact will they have on South Korea's relations with regional players? For some clues, we turn to Professor Choi Hyun-jin from Kyunghee University's Department of Political Science. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us tonight is Professor Brian Myers from Dongsa University. It's always a great pleasure to have you with us.
It's always great to be here.
All right, Professor Che, let's start with you. So this was President Yoon's third NATO summit. What would you pick as his diplomatic achievement?
Yes, for the past 3 years, as you said, President Yoon has made his presence felt at the NATO summit. And I think, his presence for these 3 years showed South Korea's very important role as a global pivotal state on the world stage. And during this summit, he pointed out that the war in Ukraine is not just a problem for Europe anymore. It's now a direct threat to South Korea too, especially after the recent military cooperation pact between Pyongyang and Moscow. And this pact could not only prolong the war in Ukraine, but also increase the nuclear threat from North Korea and creating a global security concern. And that's why the President Yoon Suk-yeol held meetings with the leaders of 12 nations during this event, including leaders from the United States and also Japan. He took this chance to make stronger ties with these countries to put more pressure on Russia and also North Korea. So as a result of this effort, NATO included a special section in the Washington Summit Declaration expressing grave concern about the military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. And moreover, the President Yoon Suk-yeol and the United States signed a joint statement on the guidelines for nuclear operation. So this agreement effectively guarantees the U.S. nuclear assets will be stationed on the Korean Peninsula in times of both war and peace. This can greatly increase South Korea's security. And finally, I'd like to also mention the presence of the Indo-Pacific Quadrilateral Partnership, or IP4, at the NATO summit. This IP4 includes South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So starting in 2022, IP4 leaders have joined the NATO summit for 3 consecutive years. And this could lead to the formal inclusion of the IP4, extending NATO's influence from the North Atlantic all the way to the Indo-Pacific.
I'm glad that you highlighted the fact that the war in Ukraine is no longer a security concern for Europe, but also for South Korea as well, especially after the signing of North Korea-Russia military pact. And this, as Russia could transfer advanced missile technologies to North Korea, which could have irreversible impact on the Korean Peninsula. Professor Myers, North Korea has condemned the NATO summit declaration, labeling it an quote-unquote illegal document. It said that the declaration incites a new Cold War and military confrontation on a global scale. What is North Korea most wary of?
Well, we're used to very strong rhetoric from North Korea, but I think the NATO summit declaration really does worry the Kim Jong-un regime to a certain extent. Most NATO summits are pretty routine affirmations of solidarity and resolve, but this one had a special urgency to it because, as Professor Choi was saying, it was all about strengthening defense capabilities in the face of a perceived threat from Russia. Now, that looks to us like a very sober response to the Ukraine war, but it may well look threatening to Pyongyang, especially in view of NATO attacks on Serbia and Libya over the past quarter century. Now, since the end of the Korean War, North Korea has seen its main enemies as, let's say, the US, South Korea, and Japan, in that order, all Pacific Ocean countries. So to be targeted in a very strong statement from NATO is probably unsettling in itself. But I think what Kim Jong-un is most wary of is that this Ukraine conflict could boil over in any number of ways, and it could draw Western Europe and the United States so deeply into it that NATO begins to regard some form of outright hostility against North Korea as necessary.
Well, North Korea, in response, also said that it will need, quote unquote, a new force and mode of counteraction against the NATO declaration. We'll see if it's just another bluffing or not. And Dr. Myers, President Yoon held a sideline summit with U.S. President Biden where they signed South Korea-U.S. nuclear deterrence guidelines, warning that any North Korean nuclear attack against South Korea will be met with a swift, overwhelming, and decisive response. How significant is this? And do you believe the newly signed guidelines will substantially raise the allies' deterrence against North Korea's nuclear threats?
Yeah, it's always hard to say because the actual substance of these agreements, what they mean in concrete military terms, is always kept secret for understandable reasons. But from the reports that I've seen, it doesn't really look like a substantial upgrade or strengthening of the so-called Washington Declaration that President Yoon and Biden signed in April last year. Yes, America will respond decisively and overwhelmingly to any North Korean nuclear attack on South Korea. But what exactly does that mean? This declaration does come with an explicit commitment to assigning U.S. nuclear assets to the alliance's missions, but that's not the same thing as promising nuclear retaliation against a nuclear attack on South Korea. So the Americans are still refusing to box themselves in that way. And that worries Seoul a bit. Now, I don't want to be over hasty again, but without knowing concretely how this agreement is going to alter military matters, I'm left with the impression that it's really about stilling the South Korean public's growing desire for an independent nuclear deterrent. We had that opinion poll a while back, which showed a majority of people here want a deterrent, and that really struck home in Washington. So I think the Americans are doing all they can with these shows of close partnership. And no doubt we down here in Busan are going to be getting more U.S. aircraft carrier visits. But whether this keeps the South Korean public happy is another matter. Honestly, I don't think it will.
Well, South Korea's presidential office said Seoul and Washington will carry out joint military drills to help implement the newly announced guidelines, which will see the deployment of U.S. nuclear assets on the Korean peninsula. But as you pointed out, the concrete details are still under the wraps, and it remains to be seen if it'll be enough to quell South Korea's growing calls to acquire its own nuclear weapons. Professor Che, Russia's foreign ministry expressed regret over what it called South Korea's NATO-style intimidation and threats of its aid to Ukraine. President Putin, meanwhile, said Moscow will respond in a way that'll be painful for Seoul. How would Seoul-Moscow relations play out from here?
Okay, so the recent harsh statements from Russia show a serious strain in the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Moscow. And the tough language from Russia indicates that tensions could grow even more in the future. So, as you said, Russia has warned of consequences for Seoul that could be painful. So, if South Korea provides, for example, lethal weapons to Ukraine, so this could mean some economic sanctions or reduced cooperation between the two countries, especially in areas like trade and investment. So while it's very difficult to fully restore this relationship, as long as Russia keeps up their military cooperation with North Korea, we cannot just ignore this bilateral relationship. So we have to handle this relationship with Russia very wisely, because Russia plays a significant role in the Korean peninsula, affecting both our security and also economy. And we also need to look out for our citizens and business operating in Russia. So it's important to keep the communication alliances with Russia open at the necessary level. However, as the war in Ukraine drags on and the military ties between Russia and North Korea continue, restoring this relationship will be very challenging. So I believe that our action toward Russia will depend on their future moves. So if they take steps that actually threaten our security, for example, providing advanced military technology or weapons to North Korea, we must act strongly against Russia. But at the same time, we should avoid escalating the situation by sending lethal weapons to Ukraine first. Okay. So ultimately, the future of our relationship with Russia is in their hands.
Well, the growing North Korea-Russia military ties may be threatening, but Russia's significant roles can't also be overlooked. Now, Professor Myers, for the first time, NATO has officially slammed China as the quote-unquote decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. China was quick to react, saying NATO was smearing China with fabricated disinformation. Do you foresee stronger China, Russia, North Korea alignment in light of the West's blunt criticism?
I do, actually, and I think it's unfortunate. You know, a French nobleman once said that if somebody is standing directly between you, right in the middle between you and your enemy, that person is always going to look closer to the enemy than to you. It's a kind of optical illusion. And I think that's a relevant comment here, because although China is indeed Russia's main trade partner, it is enabling Russia to a certain extent. It's not as close to Russia as NATO makes out. Now, China exports things that can be used in the war, sure, but let's remember American companies were making trucks in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and every truck can be used to military purposes. And, you know, China does continue to stress the importance of respecting territorial integrity. So it's not as if China has openly supported Russia's war in Ukraine. And on the other hand, there are also signs of a certain coolness between China and North Korea for whatever reasons. So I don't really understand why NATO seems determined to make these three countries, Russia, China, and North Korea, close ranks, come closer together, when really the West should be doing all it can to drive a wedge between them, to push them further apart. But I think, unfortunately, closing ranks is going to be the reaction when the strongest military alliance in the world is treating those three countries already as if they were one monolithic bloc.
And staying with you, Dr. Myers, NATO is expanding partnerships with Indo-Pacific nations, including South Korea, and NATO Chief Stoltenberg said the alliance will initiate flagship projects with its IP4 partners. NATO members are also eyeing to conduct more joint military exercises with them. How big of a threat would this be to North Korea, and would this prompt the North to consider conducting joint drills with Russia?
Well, you know, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said the other day that what happened in Ukraine could happen in Asia tomorrow. And those are really quite strong words, especially if you regard the Ukraine conflict as the product of US expansionism and provocation, which is how the North Koreans and the Russians look at it. They look at it very differently from the way we do. And of course, anything that tightens security cooperation between Japan and South Korea, as these proposed military exercises would inevitably do, is going to be perceived by Kim and Putin as an added threat. And Putin would see that, I think, as a de facto extension of NATO. If NATO were to work with the IP4 countries, he would see this as a de facto extension of NATO into a worldwide alliance, pretty much encircling Russia. Now, what nobody's talking about is the strong possibility of the South Korean government going back into left-wing hands at the next presidential election, which could well mean the end of Japanese-Korean military cooperation and a serious blow to this sort of cooperation that NATO is aspiring to. But in the meantime, I think, yes, I think Russia and North Korea will indeed be looking to conduct more joint exercises in response to this perceived threat.
And your argument is also echoed by many experts, many other experts here in Korea. They say that the North Korea-Russia Defense Pact stipulates joint measures for the purpose of boosting their defense capabilities, and this could open doors to the two countries' joint drills. Very concerning indeed. Professor Che, moving on to the Middle East. This year's NATO summit also invited Middle Eastern countries, but the war in Gaza was excluded from the official summit agenda. What were some notable remarks made by NATO leaders regarding the war?
So, as you said, during this NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the conflict in Gaza Strip was largely ignored. So NATO's joint statement didn't mention Gaza. And most leaders, including Joe Biden and also many European leaders, didn't address this issue. However, some leaders did speak out. So, for example, the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan said that the NATO should not continue its partnership with Israel until there is a sustainable peace in Palestine. So he firmly stated that any cooperation attempts with Israel within NATO will not be supported by Turkey until this peace is realized. And there's another example, the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, and he urged NATO to apply the same unity and standards to the situation in Gaza as he has to Ukraine. So he mentioned, he said that there is a need to avoid double standards to maintain strong support for Ukraine, so calling for the same level of commitment to the peace in Gaza Strip. And also, President Joe Biden said something about Gaza war right after the end of this NATO summit during press conference. So he highlighted the importance of bringing home Israeli hostages and paving the way for peace and stability in the Middle East. And Biden also mentioned that ending the war wouldn't require Israel to stop targeting Hamas leadership. In other words, the Israeli leader and Prime Minister Netanyahu can still sanction Hamas leaders even after the conclusion of a ceasefire in Gaza Strip.
Now, Israel's expansion of its military operations into the West Bank and near Lebanon poses a dangerous escalation. Do you foresee the conflict in Gaza spreading to a wider regional war? And would the U.S. and the international community be able to prevent it?
That's a very challenging question. It's hard to predict the situation in the Middle East, but I think that Israeli expansion of its military activities into the West Bank and also near Lebanon is a serious escalation that could potentially widen the conflict. And actions by Israel might prompt a reaction from other groups and players in the Middle East, for example, Iran and also Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's why the Hezbollah's leader has recently stated that his group will only stop attacking Israel if Israel agrees to ceasefire in Gaza Strip. And also, there's another reason. In Israel, domestic politics could play an important role in shaping this conflict. The Prime Minister Netanyahu is under pressure from his citizens and also ultra-conservative politicians, which might push the situation towards further escalation. However, I believe that there are still some opportunities to prevent this escalation. Currently, I believe that neither Hezbollah nor Iran wants to start a new war in the Middle East. Hezbollah's role in its alliance with Iran is mainly to act as a deterrent against a potential Israeli or American attack, especially on Iranian homeland, for example, its nuclear facilities. In other words, what Hezbollah and Iran want is not a new regional war, but how to deter a potential invasion by Israel or America. And there's another reason, a broader regional war could also lead to some severe humanitarian disaster. which might trigger international intervention. So global powers and organizations like the UN could become more engaged to stop humanitarian disaster if a larger regional war breaks out. And this might also help prevent further escalation of the conflict.
Well, hopefully Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will place peace before his political aspirations. And if I may add, the world is now facing the most dangerous security challenges since the Cold War. So we'll be sure to keep close tabs on the developments in the Indo-Pacific region as well as the Middle East. Thank you, as always, Professor Che, for your valuable insights.
Thank you very much.
And many thanks to you as well, Professor Myers, for your brilliant analysis.
Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.